to the 50 podcast. Today, I am excited to introduce our next guest, Susan Goldsmith. Susan's a veteran investigative reporter who's worked for the Oregonian, New Times Los Angeles, and the Los Angeles Daily News. She has spent years researching the pseudoscience in which is now known as shaken baby syndrome. And her work was featured in a documentary, The Syndrome. If you haven't seen it, I would highly encourage for you to watch it right away. We'll have a link down in the bottom of the description so that you can catch it. Ms. Goldsmith has won numerous state, regional, and national journalism awards, including the Casey Medal for Emeritus Journalism for her reporting on child abuse. So, Susan, thank you for joining us today.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Hey, Susan, thanks again for joining us. I'm Tom Baker. I co-host the show with Randy. And so we're going to talk about shaken baby syndrome today. And I'm sure most people have heard the term. Some people may be familiar with it, but then others, it might be something they haven't heard much about. If you meet somebody and you want to briefly explain it, could you maybe explain it to people who aren't quite sure what it is real quick, just before we start talking about it?
The original idea was that people, when child abuse began to be recognized in the 1970s in America, some theories were put forward that people were violently shaking their children, and that it was unique because there were no outward signs of abuse. So they would look fine, but they would have these catastrophic neurological problems. And the theory ended up gaining a lot of traction that it was people were violently shaking their babies and causing these impairments and deaths. And what was unique about it when it was originally put out there, theorized, was that there was an absence of any kind of outward injury. And the kickoff for this whole idea taking hold in America happened in 1997 with the Nanny Louise trial in Boston, you may remember. And
The au pair.
The au pair.
Yeah, it was really famous. It was all over CNN. And
it was all over. And even myself, when I started on this, it was like, what happened with that, right? It was a very bizarre, like, guilty, not guilty. Turns out it was a fascinating case. And one of the doctors in the syndrome was on the prosecution team of Nanny Louise. He was a Harvard neuroradiologist named Pat Barnes, who had written a chapter in a textbook at that point used in medical schools about shaken baby syndrome, promoting the idea. Well, he goes into this trial and he's in our film. It's a fascinating story. And Barry Scheck, Nanny Louise Woodward's au pair agency, did a great job of defending her and spending a lot of money. And Barry Scheck and the other defense lawyers brought in the doctor whose work the whole theory was based on, named Ayub Omaya. Right. And in that trial, Omaya said, shaken baby is in, quote, the realm of mythology, that you cannot get those injuries in an infant's head without the forces going through the neck. He was a biomechanical engineer and a neurosurgeon. And he did work for the NHTSA, safety work.
Right.
And he said in that trial that this was the work of fiction. This didn't exist, this syndrome based on his work. But nevertheless, it took hold and gained a lot of traction in medicine from that trial, even though the judge ended up letting her out. That's why we're all confused.
Right.
Because the jury found her guilty, the judge let her go. And it turned out really shaken baby syndrome was put on trial in that trial. And even though it really failed the test of evidence, having an evidence base in that trial, it took hold around the country and in medicine, and prosecutions began. And what's really scary about it then and even now is it has no diagnostic reliability, right? So it started the three things, but then people were prosecuted for one of the things: brain swelling, brain bleeding, bleeding in the back of the eye. So people were prosecuted for one, for two, for three, okay? There was a woman who was sent to prison who Jerry Brown later exonerated, named Shirley Reese Smith, who was sent to prison in 1998 for the absence of the symptoms.
Oh.
And that's such a crazy case because the Ninth Circuit ended up throwing it out and saying you cannot prosecute somebody on the absence being the presence of a problem, right? But she was. Ninth Circuit threw it out. She was let out of prison. And then it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court reinstated her conviction, saying it's up to the juries. We leave it up to the juries in the states. And Jerry Brown pardoned her. But that diagnostic unreliability continues to this day. And as
people are still using it. So there's been a lot of evidence like, hey, you shouldn't be using this, but it's so ingrained in our criminal justice system and our society that people still take it for granted. I know when I was in policing, I thought it was a thing for sure.
Absolutely. And the thing of it is police and social workers and prosecutors are relying on doctors. They call this a medico-legal diagnosis. Medico-legal, which means a medical diagnosis with legal implications. And it's extremely troubling, but the Academy of Pediatrics and other medical societies endorse it and back it no matter what comes out about it. And they've had to change the name several times. It started shaken baby syndrome. The doctors, one of the doctors in our film, Dr. John Plunkett, a pathologist, who's now dead, sadly, an amazing human being, showed that children, a lot of these problems were happening from kids hitting their heads, falling, right? So then they changed it to shaken impact. And then all of that came into question. And now it's called abusive head trauma.
Right, so it's changed forms.
It's whatever they say it is.
It reminds me of something I've seen several times, like learning about other subjects, like in academia. When you use academia, and you'll see something gets cited by somebody early on, and then several other people sort of take it for granted and they cite it as well in their research, and then the next generation of scholars come along, and there's 25 people and have cited this that are well-known academics, and it becomes accepted as knowledge when no one has really scrutinized the initial data to see if it was a valid data or not.
Absolutely, 100%. And that's what happened here. And how the country of Sweden ties into this is some higher courts throughout convictions in Sweden. And this completely speaks to your point, Dave. And they have a institution in Swedish government called the SBU. I don't know what it stands for, but when there are controversies in law, in medicine, the SBU brings on different scientists or whoever the controversy involves to determine what should we tell doctors about how many mammograms women should get or whatever the thing, right? So they were tasked maybe 5 years ago. I've been in the Swedish press about it, with looking at, because all these shaken baby convictions were thrown out by higher courts, to look at the 790 articles published in reputable medical journals attesting to the evidence that shaken baby syndrome exists. So the Swedish SBU scientists of many different disciplines go in and literally analyze every single study done, from very prestigious journals, Journal of the American Medical Association, et cetera, and came up with the finding that 2 of 798 articles had any evidence base whatsoever, and that there should be no faith put in the courts in this diagnosis.
Right. So I got a question for you before we get too deep into the weeds on this. It's interesting.
Yeah.
And the film, I checked it out as well last night. It's great. It does a great job of sort of explaining what it is and some of the things we talked about, and then some of the reasons why it should be taken. It shouldn't be, the major problems that the theory has. This is kind of a morbid sort of topic. It's when I found that when people are studying like crime or violence, things like that, I'm always just curious, like what was your path that brought you to study this, sort of maybe where you grew up, who you are, and what was your path to, and how did you become involved with this subject, and what made you feel as though I needed to devote a significant portion of my life to learning about it?
Mm-hmm. Good question. Well, I have been a daily journalism reporter and then did more magazine-like weekly journalism for many, many years, most of my time in Los Angeles. I was on OJ, I was on all different kinds of criminal cases. A lot of the reporting I did was about LA County and the Department of Children and Family Services there, and children that were known to be abused who were murdered while in the care of DCFS, like the brilliant Gabriel Hernandez documentary on Netflix.
Yes.
That was my experience, 100%, that many children in the system were being abused and murdered, often by caretakers who they were sent back to live with. So I did a lot of reporting about that. I did reporting about that here in Oregon. I got state laws passed in Oregon to help children in foster care, which had to do with a little girl born in Oregon who was put in foster care and shipped to Mexico to relatives of her illegal father's relatives in Mexico. She'd never been there, didn't speak Spanish, where she was in the care of Oregon Department of Human Services. She was tortured and murdered in Mexico. And I went to Mexico and reported on the story, and the governor of Oregon got involved and state laws were passed. So I have done a lot of reporting about very real child abuse. The only woman on death row in Oregon came out of a case I wrote about the murder of a 15-year-old girl named Jeanette Maples. Her parents beat her to death. And in that case, I got an administrative rule changed for social workers in Oregon because she had been reported to authorities as being abused, and she was 14 and 15 at the time. Her mom had already lost custody of her for abusing her in California, by the way. And the social workers interviewed her, the teen, Jeanette. She said she wasn't being abused. Their policy was if a teen's denied it, it wasn't happening. Well, Jeanette went on to be brutally murdered after that. And the rule that got changed because of my reporting was they no longer relied on what a teenager who was being abused told about their own abuse, right? Are you following?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so when one of my sources called me to say, I really think you should look into shaken baby syndrome, my first answer was, are you crazy? You mean, what are you talking about? And he said, just look into it. Just look into it. And the story that I had done right before that comes into this, which was a story I did about 2 boys in Yamhill, Oregon, about an hour outside Portland, 7th grade boys, who were being prosecuted by the Yamhill County District Attorney's Office for 5 counts of felony sexual abuse.
What grade were they in again? I'm sorry.
7th grade.
7th grade?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
For swatting the butts of little girls in their middle school hallway.
Oh my.
And they were threatened with being put on the sex abuse registry for life.
Yeah. So like 12 years old.
They're 12. They were 12 years old.
Hmm.
And my paper had covered it like they were little child rapists, sadly. By the time I got into it, I got all the records and realized this was an absolute tragedy. The abuse was the prosecutor, what the prosecutor was doing, and the jail and all of that to these children. And I wrote the story, and it caused a national uproar. People sent the kids money from all over America, and the charges were eventually dropped.
Wow.
And why that is important, because I never thought that people who were hunting for child abuse would go after boys, little boys in a school hallway. And so that's how I got into this, and just sort of
that's kind of what made you question.
Well, when somebody called me up and said, these people, and I think there's some real questions about the science, my mind had been opened to the possibility that some things were going wrong in that area of the law.
Because the boys, you felt as though that was a miscarriage of justice, and it made you question and say, well, what else could be wrong?
I talked to prosecutors all over America who told me this is happening all over America as the juvenile crime rate was falling, and that juveniles were being prosecuted in secret in juvenile courts, because you can go there, but you can't. There's a lot of rules on how you report. And I talked to people all over America who told me that this was going on, the criminalization of childhood, as the crime rate was falling precipitously. So I found that very disturbing. And so then when someone called, I would have looked into it anyway, because I try to keep an open mind and as a journalist and never have any kind of agenda whatsoever.
Right.
So a source called me up and said, a very credible source, I think you should look into this. And the first thing I did was go and see Dr. John Plunkett, who's in our film, testify in a family court proceeding, which is a whole nother story about this whole area of the law that we don't even get into in the film, the family court prosecutions, where you need only 1% of, over, we're not sure, to have somebody lose their kids.
Right.
And I spent a day watching Dr. Plunkett testify on behalf of a couple that were about to lose their children for being baby shakers. And I just was like, oh my God, are you serious? Wow, right? Throughout the day. And he was extremely articulate and credible. And shortly after that, a court in Wisconsin issued a ruling letting a woman out of prison named Audrey Edmunds. And it's in 2008, basically throwing her conviction for a shaken baby case out, ruling that there was no science to the quote unquote diagnosis of shaken baby. So that all together got me very interested, and I started calling and looking around, and I actually pitched it to the Oregonian, where I was on their investigative team. And they told me that story would never run in a million years.
Right. Yeah, I would imagine as an editor, when you're worried about revenue, subscriptions, these types of things, that the idea of, hey, we're going to start publishing about things that may help people who are being accused of abusing children.
They had given me a hard time on the butt swatter case.
Right.
And I fought very hard to have that run the way I wanted it to run. And it did. But I was told that story will never run. So I just put it aside. And 2 years later, there were mass layoffs at the Oregonian. Mm-hmm. And I was laid off. And I said, I'm going to make this as a documentary now. And I went with my cousin, first cousin, much younger than me, who's a filmmaker, and we raised the money to do it ourselves. And it was an amazing process, and we met incredible people who you see in the film, and we interviewed the doctors, and Dr. Barnes, who was on the Louise Woodward prosecution side, who after the case wrapped up, became somebody who helped defendants in those cases. He switched sides after the Louise case.
And I must say that about Dr. Barnes, because I think that, this is something that we have in absence of, and it's clearly the case. And, some of the other folks that you highlight in the film who, have been proponents of this for so long. But that Dr. Barnes really did have his own kind of come to Jesus moment of that he sat on the stand for the prosecution. And looked at these defense witnesses and going, why are they defending, these, brutal actors, right? And to the point Tom made earlier is it's a tough go when you're talking about things that a perceived child abuser is going to, quote unquote, get away with it or get off the hook, or, is it a technicality, these kinds of things. And then for Dr. Barnes to really just step away and be able to say, okay, I've heard enough for which I need to do some more exploring. And he talks about that transition that in the film of how, how he came to do his own research and really kind of dip back into his own experience in education to see that there were some really big problems with this. So one of the things that was remarkable to me when I saw the film for the very first time after a few years back after you and I talked, and one of the things that I thought about was the obvious issue that if there is a lack of neck injury, then that in of itself is puts a huge hole in the story. And then when you see, I can't remember which doctor it was, but one of the big proponents of this, how just violently he would shake this doll to demonstrate. And then simultaneously say, well, these brain injuries can come without injuries to the neck. And so in my background, after I left policing, I've been involved in automobile crash reconstruction, and I've worked with bioengineers, biomechanical engineers throughout, really over the last 15 years, pretty heavily, and realized that neck injury is a pretty easy thing to occur, right? I mean, a low impact automobile crash, at 10, 12 miles an hour can cause some problems, some visible issues with one's neck. So when I heard this from your documentary, I mean, pardon me, but I was like, yeah, of course, no shit. And that I never really even thought of. It never even entered my mind. And and I was a police officer in the 90s, so right at the height of this big scare. And your film does a really good job in showing, like, the news that was running. So when faced with this very clear, I mean, and I know that there's a lot of other evidence about vitamin D deficiencies or viral, I think, am I correct, that like bacterial?
All different. I mean, it's a generic response in the head when there's bleeding and swelling, right? It's like a bruise. I mean, you cannot divine how the bruise occurred from looking at the bruise, but that's what they're doing. This is a generic response. The brain only has so many ways to respond to different assaults, infections, whatever. And what's really interesting about this is that the people challenging this are people who know about about engineering, neurology. The people largely supporting it are pediatricians. They have assists from ophthalmologists and others, but the attack on the science did not come from within the pediatric medical community. No, and at this point, they've now sent thousands of people to prison on this diagnosis that's, very unreliable at best. And in family court, had children taken away from parents. So I think expecting them to own up to this at this point is not going to happen. They attack. When our film came out in 2014, we had applied to so many film festivals and been rejected just outright. Do you know what I mean? Like they didn't even want to deal with it. But we eventually got in 14 film festivals. And the first film festival we got accepted to was in Kansas City. And like 100 pediatricians sent a letter threatening the Kansas Film Festival and threatening to sue, and that all kinds of allegations. You can look it up. A story was done about it, a great story in Pacific Standard magazine. Lauren, I can't think of her name, but if you Google the syndrome Pacific Standard, it's all about what happened at these film festivals. They sent letters threatening legal action and saying that our film was going to engender child abuse and very disturbing things. And of course, it didn't work.
What was that coming solely from the medical field, or was it because of the relationships with district attorneys and prosecutors yeah.
Absolutely. And what's very interesting about this, we get into it a bit in the film, but there's a lot more reporting to be done about this, is the economics of this. Because there are nonprofits that sell materials and mandate in states that people watch videos to not kill their children, which is totally absurd in all of criminal justice. As you guys, as former cops, would know, you can't show somebody a brochure or a video to deter them from committing a serious felony.
Well, I was going to murder my child, but I saw this brochure. Yeah.
I saw this really poorly produced government propaganda video.
What's really disturbing about that is the primary program is called Purple Crying. It's nonsense. Yeah. And it's put out by a guy named Dr. Ronald Barr, who does the research that shows it's effective. And his wife was the executive director of the National Center on Shaken Baby Syndrome in Utah that gets the states to buy her husband's materials.
I think this is kind of a reoccurring, I think just talking about this is kind of a reoccurring theme I've seen in the criminal justice system, where there are economic interests and all those things, but there are also people who are genuinely trying to work as victim advocates, and they believe in something. And even though their motivations are admirable. So like you can think about like certain domestic violence advocacy that has led to laws that have negative impacts on communities, and sex offender registries and all these sorts of things. I think a lot of times the people that are behind it are not necessarily all nefarious. There are some wonderful people who really do care, but they just have they have accepted a body of knowledge and they're wedded to it, and it's sad to see. Well,
I'm sorry, Susan, go ahead.
Well, I would just say nothing really good comes from hysteria.
Right. That's the danger. Yeah.
And what we do in our criminal justice system should be driven by data, not by hysteria. And unfortunately, that's not what happens. And go ahead, Randy. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a really good segue, because one of the things that comes to mind, and if I just may have a moment to talk about my experience around pseudoscience or junk science, is that I was an arson investigator, and then a certified fire and explosion investigator in the private sector as well, working for insurance companies, attorneys, some government agencies. And it was pretty deep into my career, for which I learned about a man named Cameron Todd Willingham, who was accused of setting a fire and killing his 3 children in Texas. And he was on death row. He's since been executed. Governor Rick Perry, who was governor at the time, expedited his execution at the moment when scientists were screaming, "Do not execute this man." So one of the things that was remarkable to me is because my first training was in the mid 1990s. He had already been convicted by this time. And I think it was in 92, he was accused of killing. I said he killed. No, he didn't kill. There's no evidence that he killed anyone, but he was accused. The fire happened in 1992. And then when we started learning about the problems with this, it was, they were saying like, hey, the evidence that you used to say that definitively, when you see this particular evidence, these patterns, whatever it may be, that means that it had to be intentionally set. And then they were able to replicate. The University of Kentucky did a lot of work with this to replicate, to be able to show that, no, there's a lot of other reasons. So very, very similar to what we're talking about with brain injury here, right? Is that, yes, it can mean it sometimes, but in of itself, isn't the case. But one of the things that really struck me is that they had known this for a very, very long time, that there was inaccuracies in what they were teaching, but that's what I was taught too. And it caused me to go, holy cow, have I arrested somebody based on this? Or in the private sector, have I promoted someone, whose home burned down, their claim being denied, or their car catching on fire and that being denied? So having conversations about this, one of the things that I heard, kind of off the record always was, well, you don't really want to pull on that thread, right? And so I wonder, with that very long intro to a question, is that, do you think that this is a part of it too? Is that those who continue to promote this, even in the absence of scientific evidence, that there's an underlying issue of, okay, if we admit it, then we've got to admit, or if we agree with these scientific findings, then we have to admit that there's loads of people whose lives have been totally wrecked and continue to be wrecked. Not only just the people who've been arrested or incarcerated, but all the residual impacts to the families, friends, jobs, the communities from there. Because I agree with Tom. Sorry, just are you there? Oh, okay. So you had frozen for a minute. I agree with Tom that I think that there is a great deal of number of people that really, and their hearts of heart, believe it and support it, and then become kind of too blinded, by it. But do you think that there's an element of it that they're afraid of the consequence, at least the moral consequence, of admitting that we screwed up, and now a lot of people have paid for this?
It's a great question. I think that for sure, there's an estimated 1,000 people right now in prisons in America on this unreliable shaken baby abusive head trauma. Some of them are in for life. People have lost their children. The woman, Audrey Edmunds, missed her 3 daughters growing up, who was let out in Wisconsin in 2008. Yes, and I think that's part of it. I think also it's really very cultish, which we tried to show in the film. They sing songs at Shaken Baby conferences put on by the Utah group, where the wife and the husband have spun a nonprofit, for profit off the nonprofit for the materials they sell and get the states. They sing songs about defense attorneys. They've attacked me, right? I think that's a tactic, and it's really easy to write off your critics as promoting child abuse. Right. And so nobody wants to be seen doing that.
That's a terrible thing to say to somebody.
A terrible thing. And, they get a lot of mileage out of, we're protecting the children. But one thing that really shocked me researching this film super deeply in this material was finding out that 3 of the key people who are promoters behind Shaken Baby Syndrome, sit on the board of the Utah group, are with the Academy of Pediatrics Child Abuse and Neglect Committee, were very much, especially one of them, very much involved in promoting satanic panic abuse in childcare settings in the 80s.
Well, in fact, if I may say, one of the pieces of evidence that was introduced in Todd Willingham's case was that they found this accusation that he was a part of a satanic cult because they found a poster with a pentagram on it. The poster was the band Rush, who had the album 2112, which had a pentagram on the cover. That's what he had hanging in there. And so like in the film where you guys talk about this whole connection with this satanic cult stuff and the stuff that happened with the daycare centers workers, I again thought right back to Willingham, because I was like, this is the same thing. That's just absurd claims that can be made with not a shred of evidence. And this man is dead. I mean, we've murdered him.
I read David Grand's sensational New Yorker piece about that case and was so disturbed. You're right. People don't understand. People expect that our court system is built on science, solid principles, evidentiary principles. What is let in has a solid evidentiary base. Well, that is absolutely not the case with shaken baby syndrome, shaken impact syndrome, now abusive head trauma. The base, there is no base. And the problem I see is when you have police officers and social workers and child abuse pediatricians saying, they tell the court this is not in dispute. This diagnosis is cooked up, the controversy is cooked up by sleazy defense experts. That's what they say.
Right, because a very central part of Daubert being admitted as an expert is the acceptance of your theory among your peers. That's right. So then it creates this kind of vicious cycle for which if you're speaking against what your peers have collectively accepted, even when wrong, then it's difficult to be acknowledged or admitted as an expert. I'll mention 2 other points about this. That what you said about, this, I guess we all have this kind of naive belief that the justice system would rely on science. 2 things is first is when Attorney General Lynch served under President Obama. So this is, not, this isn't Jeff Sessions or Bill Barr, right? I mean, this is, one that, most liberals would hold up as a fair attorney general. A report was sanctioned by President Obama to look at comparative evidence, which includes like tire marks, bite marks, this whole thing. There's a lot of junk science behind there. And the scientists warned the attorney general to pass on to law enforcement, DAs, police departments, is that not that they said it was just total junk, but they said that there was huge amounts of propensity for error, and that these things should be approached with a bit of skepticism. her response when asked about it was, I think scientists should be scientists and let law enforcement be left up to us. Mm-hmm. And I was shocked that she would say it, because again, it was someone that, we did kind of held up. But a couple of years later, I was less shocked. And it came out of a study from Pew, who did a study called Behind the Badge, where they interviewed police officers. And one of the questions that was asked was, do you believe that science plays a significant role in policing, or should it? And a overwhelming plurality said none or little.
Wow.
Yeah, and it is. I was like, science plays a role in McDonald's. I mean, of course science does. But this rejection of science, which I think goes back to what you said earlier, that I think is an amazing point, is that nothing good is built on hysteria. And I think, Tom would kind of agree, is that when we simplify training or simplify policing inside of training to be good versus evil, and that's it, right? I mean, there's no gray area to it. Well, that's where hysteria can come in, and then it is, as we've mentioned, that then you're supporting the bad guy or the evildoers, especially the worst kind of evildoers who would harm a child, right?
The police are in a very terrible situation with respect to these cases, because the medical officials are telling them these are the bad guys.
Yes.
The doctors, the police officers, the detectives, the prosecutors don't know how to read radiology reports, nor do pediatricians, for that matter. But you see, they have the children's hospitals do the forensic interviewing for the police departments for these cases. So the doctors are telling the detectives, hey, I run the child abuse team at Cedars-Sinai, at County USC, wherever. This is child abuse. What are the police officers and detectives and prosecutors supposed to do in that situation? And this is a really big problem, because they are relying on the doctors to tell them. And in this case, it's a really bad reliance. I mean, they can't question the doctors.
No, I remember that feeling. I remember having certain types of victims that we would take to a medical professional to conduct a forensic interview and an exam, and having just in my mind, well, I don't understand that body of knowledge. There's no way I can learn that, and I need to rely on their expertise, and the courts and the state and society has given them these titles because they earned them. So what they say I should respect, because I don't know this. They're the expert.
For sure. And what's really nefarious, what's happened in the shaken baby syndrome abusive head trauma context, is as the challenges have become greater and greater and greater, and courts here and there are ruling in pretty fluky justice, but this is bogus, this isn't a good conviction, right? What's happening now is the pediatricians have created a specialty called child abuse specialty, where they learn about all the things to discount that the defense experts have proven, right? So, but they now go into court and say, not only am I a pediatrician, I am a specially certified child abuse doctor, right? Who on a jury is going to question a child abuse doctor? But I can tell you, there's real problems there. This has scared me a lot. I have kids. I had little babies, young kids, when I was researching this film. And I know doctors around the country who are afraid to take their own children to emergency departments because they're afraid of being accused of child abuse.
Yeah, and kids get hurt. I know I had two, and I remember, one of his teeth got knocked out.
Oh,
fell
I
on
had
the
a
ice.
broken arm, a dislocated this and that. Absolutely. But, scary. Go ahead.
Yeah, in the film, there's a bit of B-roll, I think, that you guys have when Dr. Plunkett is talking about falls, and there's a child sitting on the edge of the couch and flipped backwards. My son, that happened to my son when he was about, and so the moment I saw it, I was like, thank God that, that he didn't, I didn't have to take him to the hospital. And I think about this, with these folks that are sitting there in court, and I mean, I don't know how they stay quiet. I mean, because honestly, I think if I were sitting in court and hearing this over, I would just be screaming over and over and over. They'd throw me out of the courtroom, I'm sure. But I mean, I think this idea that that we don't put ourselves in the position of like, you could be accused of something, wrong as well. And then they launch, they put these experts up, and I think that you made a really good point about the physicians behind this. And Tom, you talked about it as well, because I kind of went through that with about fire science, as I was like, oh my God, and it really, really got to my conscience about that. I've been a part of this. I've been, making findings based on something that was wrong, but how would I ever know? Right. Because I mean, I'm not a, fire science PhD,
right.
Right. And we attack, or I don't want to say attack, but we criticize quite a bit about the lack of rigorous training that police officers get relative to things like forensics. But it does boil back to is that no matter, if we send them to a 2-week school or a month school or a 6-month school, they're still probably going to be relying on somebody who is a doctor or a PhD or, someone heavily embedded in the science community. And so they're just parroting, basically. So one question that I have, and I had read about, I had Googled Dr. Plunkett to hear that he had passed. And again, I hope all the folks that are listening will go out and watch it. And one of the things that I would predict is that you'll fall in love with Dr. Plunkett very, very quickly. He's was an amazing man. It sure seems, but So one of the things that came up was about him being charged in Oregon for perjury, which was clearly, anyone would see that this was retaliatory in nature. And then, and I know, that they talked a lot about him personally, and again, kind of. Type things. What happened with you? I mean, so you mentioned about like during the film festivals, but you personally, what did you experience? I imagine your inbox was.
Yeah, I was thinking that. What are her DMs look like?
Well, it was very interesting because when our film, The Syndrome, premiered at 14 film festivals. In some of the places, the promoters of Shaken Baby Syndrome would contact the press to denigrate the film before it played in that film festival city. I've been attacked. We had a really interesting scene outside a film festival in Wyoming, where was it? North Dakota, where people came with their kids in wheelchairs and like oxygen tanks. I'm shaken. Do I not exist? And that was very interesting because I invited them in to come see the film. Yeah. Just see it. We could talk after. And one of the moms came and thanked me.
Oh, good. Well,
I think that was very hard because her kid is messed up and the babysitter took a plea deal. And that's a very important point in these cases. The law professor in our film, Deborah Turkheimer, who's a former Manhattan DA child abuse prosecutor herself, says that the biggest discounts in the criminal justice system happen in this area. So you could be facing 15 to 25, and they give you 2 years probation on the agreement that you admit to doing it. And then they use that as evidence that the syndrome exists.
Yeah. So it becomes just a self-fulfilling confirmation, right? It's noteworthy to hear what pushback that you got. But what have you seen positively come from? You mentioned the work that was done in Sweden, but here in the U.S., have you seen some substantial changes since the film?
Yeah, we have played in 17 states for continuing legal education credit.
Oh, nice.
And we have an information page. Anyone listening to this, if you go to thesyndromefilm.com, we put together a resources and information page. And people have used that to successfully push back on these charges. We know of a Marine sergeant named Aaron Rashid who reached out to us. We had him and his attorney looked at all these resources, read them, and went into court and argued and got everything dropped. So the pushback is very real, though. Now on the Daubert level, the proponents of shaken baby syndrome / abusive head trauma are now preemptively writing to courts to say to judges, there's no controversy with this. Just know there's no controversy. So now the brilliant people on the other side are having to write to say, well, in fact, there is a controversy. And this many courts have overturned these convictions, and this country of Sweden, etc. But it's a battle. It's a battle, and people are not being let out of prison in the numbers that they should be. This is an absolutely, totally unreliable diagnosis that has no criteria whatsoever. And people are sitting in prison accused of being child abusers and child killers.
You mentioned the numbers, and that's one of the things I found really interesting that you talked a little bit about, is how difficult it is to quantify this. So can you maybe talk a minute or so, just give us a minute, like how, if I were to ask you, well, how many people have been to prison for this because of evidence regarding shaken baby syndrome, what would your answer be?
My answer would be that's impossible to know for the following reason. When somebody is charged, when doctors tell police, this is a shaken baby case, and go to the prosecutors charge it as child abuse 1, child abuse 2, manslaughter, homicide, you know what I mean? There's no charge for shaken baby syndrome or abusive head trauma. Right. So they bring it under various homicide charges, child abuse charges. So you don't know when you see how many people are convicted of child abuse involved shaken baby syndrome allegations. You just see a child abuse conviction.
So there's no, like, on the death certificate, there's no box that a coroner checks or something
there is
checks, but that specifically says shaken baby syndrome. Is that?
Yeah, they do. They do put that in death certificates, but that's not a legal charge. You have to bring it through a statute on the books for child abuse.
Because it could be the non-fatalities, it could be child suffered injuries,
right,
that type of thing.
Exactly. And so they don't specify, so you don't know exactly who's in for what, but there's a lot of people in prison. A lot of people took plea deals so they wouldn't go to prison. It's a disaster. And then the secondary part of it is when the prosecutors don't feel like they have enough evidence for criminal court, which in this case you can see they start with really nothing, but they take it to family court where you only need 1% above, right? 51 to 50 to 49. So people lose their children in family court. It's not a criminal charge. but they
Right, just the
still-
preponderance of evidence.
preponderance of evidence. So they lose their children. So the wreckage is massive. It's a very sad situation, but the cool things to come out of it are the defense attorneys being trained around the country, and people, we've gotten calls from very high-powered law firms have screened us for their pro bono committees, and some of those committees are now getting people out of prison. And we got contacted by a professor in Japan because Carol Jenny in the film, one of the proponents of Shaken Baby, has taken the whole theory to Japan. There's a law professor in Japan who started an innocence project for Shaken Baby cases.
Wow.
And reached out to us, can we do a Japanese translation of your film for our clinical interns? And now they're getting people out of prison in Japan. They've reached out to us to let us know. So
this may sound like a strange, I'm sorry to ask so many questions, but I'm interested in how things are documented. So the deaths, if they have a box on the coroner report that's sort of replicated in all 50 states, and US jurisdictions are sort of very, very similar, and that's on the form, has anyone thought about trying to get that taken off of the form?
Yes.
What does that look like?
That's how Audrey Edmunds got out of prison. The first one in Wisconsin, or one of the first, is medical examiners are now changing the cause of death in many of these cases, because like Randy so open-mindedly did, science evolves, things evolve. And in this case, you guys, pediatricians, how are they going to know about biomechanical studies? And are pediatricians going to really go and learn neuroradiology for something they probably won't even see in their career, right? I mean, so they're just relying, just like you said, relying on the experts and the experts and the experts. But I'll tell you, you take a kid, an infant, to a hospital with some kind of head neurological problem, you could be going out of that hospital in handcuffs. If you can't explain it, if the child abuse team reads abuse in it, that's it.
It might be also just thinking about this, as if the CDC has a great deal of influence over what ends up in these death certificates. If it's something that's an option available to the people certifying the deaths, then it seems like that would legitimize it. It would add a lot of legitimacy to it as a syndrome, like that it's valid. I wonder if there were ever an attempt to work with the CDC and explain to them, hey, you shouldn't have this on death certificates. This is not something that should be considered a valid cause of death. Has there ever been anyone trying to work at it at the federal level to try to make it?
Well, there's nothing federal with this because it's state by state, right? For the state, but the Academy of Pediatrics has told in its position papers and continually writes. Now, I don't know what the CDC.
I'm thinking about that because they do the death certificate. So death certificates, they all model in every state. They're so very tightly modeled off of the CDC recommendations for death certificates. Mm-hmm. And so if it's on the death certificates, I would expect that the CDC has had some role in saying, yes, this is something that should be on a death certificate. But it may be that they have just it's something that I'm just thinking it might be an avenue to worthy of someone looking into is because that seems like legitimizes it. And if it's a science that's been undermined, then they should be made aware of it and reassess whether or not that's the category that they have on death certificates. If it is on you said it was on death certificates, you think it's?
Yeah, well, the medical examiners have issued a statement years ago that Shaken Baby was in the realm of fiction.
Right.
There are medical examiners who've changed their position. I'll tell you, sometimes the higher courts let people out when that happens. Other times the proponents make the argument to the court. There is no controversy going on. This is cooked up by reporters and sleazy defense experts and whoever else they can just write off. And there is not the kind of pushback to this that you would really hope there would be. I mean, there's no, I'm the pushback. The defense attorneys, the people who are looking at the problems with forensic science, the innocence projects, but courts continue to affirm these convictions. These cases are still being brought. It's very distressing. There's people in prison. And in England, they ran the one really powerful, like John Plunkett of England, doctor, it's a female neuropathologist, her name will come to me. The Medical Society of England ran her out, prevented her now from testifying in the defense of people charged with this in England. There's nobody in England to defend these people. So
it has momentum now, like it's built up momentum. So now it's going to take a lot to change public opinion. You know, that's what that's the way your film starts the process, you know, doing. So. Yeah.
Well, what if I know we're running up on time, but I'd love to get one more question in, if I may, because I'm curious to know if after your work with this, is either or are you just still kind of knee deep in the work relative to this, or has this turned you down another path of looking at other issues around pseudoscience or junk science, for which we have people lamenting in prison or with convictions. And by the way, I just wanted to say is that I kind of naively thought when I started becoming aware of like junk science, you know, especially like, the shaken baby, of course, some of the junk around fires, bite marks, tire marks, some with fingerprints, is I thought that, you know, there would be this idea that we'd be like, oh, holy hell, we got to get these people out of jail, right? And that isn't the case. So, but has this opened doors for you to look at other areas inside the criminal justice system that's similar to this?
You know, I'm very interested in forensics and how the intersection of criminal law and science come together. Right now, I have a TV docuseries, a true crime docuseries that is in the process of being sold. It's investigative, but it's not really forensics, a little bit. But I'm very interested in the subject, and I continue to do interviews like this one because I think it's really important for people to see. I think if I didn't have my background getting laws passed and covering child abuse for years, I never could have done this because people attacked me. But it was hard to attack me when I got laws passed to help vulnerable children. But
you're a credible messenger. You've come from a background.
You would think so, but I know the proponents of Shaken Baby have written articles in newspapers and held seminars at their national Shaken Baby conference attacking me, and I'm fine with that. That's fine. If that's how they want to conduct themselves. You see, they sing songs. Plunkett was prosecuted. This is their response to their science being undermined, is to attack. And that's a sad state of affairs when people's lives are on the line.
Absolutely. Well, Susan, first, it was great talking to you again. It was great watching the documentary again. So we'll have a link down in the description below, but there's a couple of platforms that are carrying the syndrome. And you can also go to their website, thesyndromefilm.com. And that has links to be able to watch the documentary as well as some of the resources that Susan has shared with us. So thank you very much. We hope your inbox doesn't get too blown up once again. But keep up the good fight, and thank you for all the work that you have done.
Absolutely. And this was really interesting, and it was a great conversation. And I can't believe that it's been an hour already. I felt like we've been at about 20 minutes. So thank you very much. It was great meeting you.
My pleasure. And I love the work you guys are doing. Great work. Thank you so
Thank you
much
very
for
much.
having me.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you so much.